So let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CFTE Roundtable. My name is Candace Liger, and I serve as the Director of Trauma-Informed Weightlifting here at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. Thank you for spending part of your day to join us in the virtual ethers to talk about today's conversation, which is beyond performance, trauma, strength, and mental health in youth movement spaces. And I think this is a really important conversation because it's a reminder that movement has not ever really just been about movement, right? Especially for youth. Every weight room, every gym, dance studio, PE class, every practice, athletic field, classroom is all a space where their mental health lives, and environments where we can really be very intentional about how our mental health can thrive. So, why did we choose this roundtable? Well, one thing that we've done here at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, especially around the conversation of youth, is ask a really central question. How can we create movement spaces that aren't simply just about performance, that aren't just about getting to the data, the fastest time, the heaviest lift, the highest batting average, right? But how can we think about movement in a way that actually helps improve youth development and improve youth's experience of movement, which ultimately will translate into the rest of their lives? We know that youth mental health is one of the hugest and most defining conversations in public health in this generation. And inside of that, we also know that coaches, teachers, trainers, therapists, athletic directors, and parents are seeing much more anxiety, burnout, emotional dysregulation, disengagement altogether, and a high level of stress that maybe we have not seen at this level before. Many of us weren't always trained to understand what we're actually looking at. So today's conversation is really about raising our understanding of youth mental health, specifically during this particular movement. Very exciting stuff. Of course, Mariah was a part of this research, but this was a study that was recently published in June in the Strategies Journal. Tells us that 64% of adults in the United States have reported at least one adverse childhood experience, and that number increases significantly before the age of 18, climbs to almost 83%, especially inside of inner city youth. And that research brings us something that we want to sit with today. Some of the behaviors that we're recognizing that may have been called defiance or disengagement or attitude are also indicators that maybe something else is happening. Maybe they're not behavioral problems at all. Maybe they are adaptations or nervous system responses. And how can we look at this differently and consider new possibilities for how we understand these moments as they show up? I'll also name that this feels even more especially important because social media is definitely doing a thing. Constant stimulation, chronic stress, and we also know this shows up in adults who are navigating high levels of stress and pressures that ultimately get carried into the classrooms, the gyms, or the performance spaces. So recognizing this reality allows us to think about this from a much more nuanced perspective, and hopefully really think about how can we manage any work to support behavior, support creating environments where youth can ultimately thrive. So before we get too deep into the conversation, I'm actually going to hand it off to the director of Center for Trauma and Embodiment, Jen Turner. Would you mind sharing a few words with us? And so glad you're here.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that opening too, Candace, and framing this conversation. So my name is Jen Turner, and I am the executive director and co-founder of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment. The big project here at the center has really been about, how do we use these really powerful ways of movement to translate and to actually apply to how we can heal from trauma, from stress, from mental health challenges. And youth are such a powerful kind of community around that because of how much activity youth do, just even at baseline. Maybe that filters out as we move into adulthood, but at most youth are engaged in sports in a really powerful way, and certainly a range there. These roundtables are a great opportunity, and I'm so glad that you're here to join us to deepen into conversation. We often get to have these really interesting and thought-provoking conversations at the center, and we want to invite you into those and invite you into conversation, curiosity, learning, maybe even challenging as we continue to understand and turn over a different way of looking at healing from trauma. And so I'm really glad you're here. I'm so excited to hear what our panelists have to say. And I'll just hand it right back to you, Candace.
There we go. Thank you so much, Jen. So, without further ado, let's introduce some of the panelists that we have here. An amazing group of folks. Very excited to have you here. First, we have Ian. Ian Kilpatrick is the Boston lead for the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sports, where he partners with coaches, schools, and community leaders to create healing-centered, trauma-informed sport environments. He also serves as the head of development at Inner City Weightlifting, expanding opportunities for individuals impacted by systemic racism, violence, and incarceration. Ian is a lifelong athlete, coach, and youth advocate who believes that meaningful relationships and intentionally designed movement spaces can be powerful catalysts for healing and change. Thank you so much for being here, Ian. We also have C. Brown. C. Brown is a veteran educator and coach with more than 25 years of teaching, physical education, and weight training, and over 30 years coaching student athletes. Former collegiate softball player with a master's degree in kinesiology, C leads a nonprofit CrossFit program at their high school, working closely with school psychologists and student support teams to build trauma-informed spaces for youth. C brings professional expertise and personal experience as a trauma survivor to this work, and a deep commitment to helping young people build confidence, resilience, and belonging through strength training. We also have Angelica. Angelica here is a licensed clinical social worker, trauma therapist, and trauma sensitive yoga facilitator, specializing in integrative trauma informed care for youth, adults, couples, and families. Through private practice and consultation, Angelica supports schools and organizations in implementing trauma sensitive and restorative practices while integrating somatic approaches, including trauma sensitive yoga, into healing. Their writing has been featured in Embodied Healing and the Journal for Social Work Education. And as I've mentioned, I am the director of trauma informed weightlifting and have been a part of CFTE for almost about 5 years now. And I I come into this as a trainer for 15 years now. Um, and I've spent a lot of time working with youth, especially those in inner cities, working with like jump ropes and weights at the same time. So let's go coordination. So give you an idea of what we'll discuss today. Part one, we'll dig into like what's really happening inside of our movement spaces. Talk a little bit about adolescent mental health and how the physical, social, cultural trauma can shape youth experiences in sport and movement. And also, how do we start to recognize stress? How do we recognize burnout and disengagement? It's like, how's it showing up? And then in part two, we'll get into practice. What are some practical tools that we can bring to support healthier environments? We'll talk about coaching, trauma-informed coaching practices, maybe psychological safety, autonomy, amongst some other things. I would also like to name both Ian and C. Brown, at least, are also certified in trauma-informed weightlifting. So it's excited to have them on the panel. C. Brown, you actually graduated in the latest cohort in March. Is that right?
If I can get the thing to work, yes, I did this past one. Thank you.
Yeah. Big stuff. Okay, there's your pen. All right, so I'm actually going to stop sharing so we can get into the conversation right now. I will say also too, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So if do questions do come up as we are speaking, please feel free to drop those in the chat. We have Rachel here, who's also at the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, who's helping moderate the chat space. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in. We'll be happy to take those as we near the end. So let's stop the share for a moment and just get into the conversation. So, see, I actually would love to come to you first. And I'm asking because I know you have professional experience and personal experience. If you don't mind, maybe taking us back to a moment perhaps early on in your work, or it could be more recent, I suppose, where you saw firsthand what it means when a young person's mental or emotional state collides inside of performance. Whether that is, as I know, especially considering that you have the CrossFit gym inside of the high school, what did that moment really teach you about your approach to this work, and maybe share a little bit about what happened?
Um, I can think of a couple. If I go back a few years, we actually have a student now who's a pitcher in Major League Baseball. He pitches for the Toronto Blue Jays. Um, he was in my CrossFit class. Very driven. But when you looked at like the whole team, right? He was one of the good players, but he wasn't the, oh my God, this kid's gonna go, like, because we did have a couple kids at that on that team that they were the stars. Everybody saw them as the stars. Everybody saw, hey, where's he going? Is he gonna get drafted? Like the talk. And this kid, he, as a freshman, he was driven to do that. Like that was his goal and his intention. Um, he wasn't at the time, he was a good baseball player, but as far as his physique, he was a little bit on the underneath, like not the specimen, that you would think of a baseball player. And he was very, very hard on himself as far as like, if this is the goal and this is where I need to go, I have to do like when I first got him, I had him as a freshman in PE, and he was always, they do their baseball workouts and then you'd see him doing core workouts. I had the opportunity to have him in my CrossFit class and started to have conversation with him, like, letting him realize that you yes, you have a goal, and yes, we want to look at the goal, but let's break it down so you can actually see the next step. And, if you're trying to get over the cliff, you can't see the top until you get closer to it. So let's start breaking it down. And in doing that, we started, like, okay, we're going to work on the process. We're not going to worry about what the outcome is. We're just going to go for the next thing. We want to build on this and build on this. And one of the first things I noticed is that when we got him to focus more on, if I put in quality work when I'm working, then I'm not as tired. I'm more alert. His grades, like all of the things kind of come together. And he just kind of put his head down and he worked. He didn't brag about things, like he started to have more milestones, and, those things compounded. And then obviously he went to college and then he got drafted. And again, even in the draft, they're like, oh, this is a long shot. And he actually made it up, pretty quick, and he's doing a really good job. Um, from a very big athlete perspective, that would be one. And then I have another student, a non-athlete, like no sports at all, but just seeing her, like the mental health stuff, like the things going on at home, underneath the rug that people don't know about. And the confidence that that person gains by just putting in the work to do the lifts. And I want to work on myself, not necessarily for a physique thing, but just like I want to feel better. I want to feel something other than pain, or, like having to relive things. Was kind of more of a, like, you could kind of see the person blossom versus always kind of staying tucked away and out of the picture, so to speak. Um, but those would be my two big examples that I kind of like remind myself, okay, those are why I do this, um, when things are in a lull.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that, C. And I
Oh,
really love
thank
this
you.
this idea of having to break it down into smaller pieces, because that is the tendency with the youth. It's like they think about this huge picture, the major outcome, final end game, and then really saying, hey, there's steps along the way that we can think about where you need to flourish along the way, that we can support you flourishing with each of the
Yeah.
developmental steps. I'm wondering, Ian, you've spent years inside of communities, especially with sport. What feels most different about mental health, stress, or even relationship to movement and sport, that from the youth that maybe you work with compared to even a decade ago? Are you noticing any differences in how youth are showing up or relating to the pressures that come with sport?
Thanks, Candace. Yeah, I mean, when I first kind of saw this question, I'm like, wow, 10 years ago, I was like, how do I remember what was going on 10 years ago? But that is kind of right around when I started to get involved with, making movement and fitness part of my actual like work and career, and started to kind of learn about the impact and the power of it. I would say, to answer your question, um, the the thing about movement and stress is that, I think kids and youth specifically, like their relationship to movement doesn't change, and the brain development of youth, doesn't change. It's the environments that are changing. So, what has changed in the environments in 10 years is kind of the best way to look at this. And I would say, there's a lot more stress around parents, and kids feel that, so parents are having to work more. Both parents are working full time. um, Sports are more expensive, so if you want to actually do a sport activity after school, it costs something, and there's less kind of free programming than there used to be, at least from my perspective. I can't speak to every part of the country. um, and then the third thing, of course, you already touched on it in the intro, but tech, social media, screens, uh, those things all change. I was just talking to a parent, and her kids, they'll just go out and play in the neighborhood, right? But if they kind of get it in their head that they want to play with their iPad, it becomes a battle. But if they don't even see the iPad and it's up on a shelf or something, they're going out and playing in the street, just like I remember doing as a kid. Um, and so, again, it comes down to parents. Can parents be around to not just throw someone an iPad? And because I've been there, and I'm it's not a judgment. It's more about, like, what the demands are on parents. So I really think, like, the simple answer is that a lot of stuff has changed. Environmentally, I think kids still get the same impact from movement, still get the same stress relief from movement and play. But we've made it harder in general, to access it, for a lot of different reasons. And then I also, on the positive side, I don't want to just speak to the negative, but on the positive side, and shout out to, places like trauma informed weightlifting, and CHJS that I'm a part of. But we know a lot more. We know a lot more about how to make sport work better for every different kid. Now, implementing that and making it um, a system wide norm, and just, what turning it from what we've always done to what we're going to do, and what we're doing. I think that's the other challenge. But we know more about how movement affects a kid's brains as it develops, and how it relieves that stress, and how it heals from trauma. So these things just are known a lot more, and we have the ability to improve coaches, and improve coaching, and improve youth programs, and improve schools. It's just a matter of kind of it becoming a little bit more systemic. So, and then I didn't want to open this can of worms, but then you have, like, you know NIL. I don't want to go too deep into that, but it is a very real thing that changes stress, again, kind of filtered through parents. That pipeline into NIL and, like, high performance sports. I think we just saw, Norway. NIL is national or no image and likeness, name, image, and likeness. So, basically, kids can get paid. Kids can essentially become professional at a young age through their sport. And it's a whole can of worms that goes along with college sports as well. So, um, I'll leave it there.
I'm actually really glad that you opened that can of worms. So my son is 18, and like him and his friends are all talking about NIL deals. They're talking about NIL deals more than they're talking about like what majors they're going for in college. I always have to like reroute them back into the conversation. But you brought up a really important point, like what is the difference between what's happening developmentally and environmentally with youth, and like differentiating between like what's happening on either side, right? And including like the social, cultural variables as well. Angelica, I'm wondering, I know you sit at the intersection of both clinical therapy and somatic practice. What are you noticing? And also, what what are you noticing that might potentially be misunderstood by adults that are happening with youth?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that you mentioned, Candace, social media, and I feel like that is just an enormous component of what's going on right now, because young people aren't just getting the old pressures that we were always getting from parents, peers, and coaches, and whoever else, teachers, but also getting this enormous amount of pressure from media. We're seeing, they are seeing, they're constantly inundated by AI enhanced imagery and people who are making it look like this is easy and that my life is just I train, I'm happy, I'm whatever it is, but we're they're seeing all of these things that make the dream that they might have feel totally inaccessible, even beyond what it was before. So before there was like an imagined dream, and now there's this dream that's like kind of pre-prescribed and not actually based in reality. And so young people are working up against a lot there. And I think that that shows in what we're seeing in terms of youth mental health and the immense amount of depression that young people are facing, anxiety, um, and often feeling like they end up having to stop being involved with the movement spaces that they've been involved with, um, because they can't make it anymore. They reach this point of burnout. And I think specifically of, so I've had the unique experience of working with young people who are kind of in the midst of their journey, and then with slightly older folks, young adults. And I think specifically of this college student that I worked with, saw in therapy, and um, she had spent her whole childhood and adolescence training really hard as a gymnast, and ended up with really significant mental and physical health challenges from that experience that she went through. And most of our work together was kind of undoing this idea that her only worth or value was her performance, and seeing her as a whole human who, even if she couldn't perform, was still worthwhile, still had purpose and meaning. And so I think it, to me, always comes back to like, how do we hold the whole young person, beyond just like maybe their goal this moment in time? How can we see all the components of who they are and hold them there?
Thank you so much for that response. And I'm glad you also brought up, where there's a pattern of maybe some disengagement, burnout, even some factors that contribute to that. I think what could be helpful too is maybe, and I'll kind of just ask this question of all the panelists. If C, you want to start us off, where we're in unique positions. Angelica, you're a clinician, and we have C and Ian who are kind of more leaning towards the coach end. We're in a unique position to recognize and see some behaviors that youth may exhibit, some of which could potentially be trauma manifestations showing up in real time. And so while we want to be mindful to not diagnose certain behaviors, it's like this is a particular trauma response, maybe it will help to offer some context of what does this look like in real time when working with athletes? What are some of the behaviors that show up, some challenges that show up that we can ultimately work to be more mindful about how we approach inside of coaching, training, and even mental health support. C, do you mind taking us off and maybe sharing like some manifestations or behaviors that you've had to at least tend to that have been uniquely challenging?
Yeah, thank you. I've seen, sometimes particularly the kids that have kind of been like driven into choosing only one thing when they were very, very young. They give up something else that they like. So that's one part of it. But two is now, like I'll use baseball, softball as an example. Where you used to play for maybe 3 or 4 months, these kids are playing for 12 months. Like they're throwing almost every single day, and you have a 15, 16-year-old kid who's having Tommy John surgery because that's all they do. And I think some of it is like they they want to receive the love from the parent. Like, and a lot of times the parents, like, they weren't a very good athlete and they have this kid that is, and they're like kind of living through them. Um, but the kid will overwork themselves because they want to make them happy. They want to prove to them that they're like their self-worth is very much tied to how did you do in the game, you know, um, versus did you have fun in the game, like, and yes, the higher you get up, it's those things are important, but that shouldn't be the number one focus. Um, so I think when they're doing that, now they have, they're getting more injuries than they had before. And one of the biggest things I've had to deal with in that way is like taking the kid and saying, hey, I've noticed lately, you went from this injury to this injury to this injury. Let's tone it back a little bit. And a lot of times, I find out that not only are they doing my workouts, they're again like the kid Mason I was talking about earlier, they're going home and doing, another hour or two or three because they're trying to reach this pinnacle that is probably not realistic at the time. So they'll overwork themselves, or they get to a point and, things are going on and they now are no longer interested in it. So I've kind of seen it fall on both ends where, either they're overworking themselves to try to meet all the, tick all the boxes for whomever it is that they're trying to do that for, or they suddenly don't want to have any interest, like, they're kind of like, I don't care about that anymore, I don't want to do that anymore. Who cares? That kind of, which what it would seem lazy to you, but it's just they're overwhelmed and overworked and, you know,
Yeah.
sometimes pushed into something that they just probably wasn't their thing in the first place. But when you choose something at 5 years old, you don't know what you're good at and you haven't tried other things, so how do you know? So I think that would be the biggest thing.
Yeah, thank you so much, C. Ian,
I
would you
think
mind sharing maybe a little bit of what are you seeing happening with the coaches who are supporting these athletes?
Yeah, I mean it's a wide spectrum, and it depends on kind of what knowledge coaches have. I think a lot of times coaches are coming in and they're essentially just doing what was done with them, or they're doing what they see on TV, because you have coaches that are volunteers, and we need we need those coaches in youth sports. But they're also not like systems of learning what is the best way to coach, especially when you're seeing behaviors like this. So when we at CHJS, when we train coaches, we talk a lot about brain science in a digestible way. Um, but when we boil it down, and maybe we do a session that's with teenagers that are actually going to be coaches for youth. So we boiled down that brain science to basically like every second that you're with a kid, their brain is assessing if they're safe and if they belong. So it's a simple concept to answer those two questions as someone working with youth. And then if you can answer those questions and it's no, then how do we make those questions answered to yes, right? Am I safe? Do I belong? Because a kid's brain, and they're not thinking it, it's literally just what their brain is doing. And their answers are not necessarily connected to what is happening in that moment. You know, it could be it could be what's happening at home, and it could be happening what's happening in their own, you know, neurological development. So we as coaches don't know necessarily if they're answering yes or no to those questions. All we can do is provide the environment where we're doing everything we can to make the answer to those questions yes. And so some of the things that we focus on, you know, is patterned movement. There's a really there's a calming effect of patterned movement. It's why like just playing catch back and forth is a very like or you know, soccer back and forth, or shooting free throws, or dribbling drills. Like these things are all scientifically like calming things to do. Connections, you know, a coach actually going out of their way to connect with the players and not just be a dictator, but actually connecting, asking questions to their athletes and getting to know them, what's going on with them. Not to be their social worker, but so that the kid trusts them and feels connected to them. Because if they're connected, then they're feeling safe and they belong. And we can actually override those other things that are happening that might be causing those questions to be no. We can override. That's the cool thing about the brain, is that we can actually change that as coaches, regardless of what might be happening at home or at school or elsewhere. And then yeah, so I'll leave it there, but it's essentially comes down to those two questions, and how can we help create those environments where the answer is always yes. Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. Absolutely. Angelica, I want to kind of bring it back around to you to see if you have any follow-up thoughts before we kind of get into the next section here.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think that I think that one thing that's important that you all have touched in on is that there can be this idea that um, kids are being lazy, they're being something, and what really is happening is like every one of those things that you see or notice, especially when it's a change in a young person, is a signal that like something's going on and they're trying to communicate something. You might see like clinically we use the words like tension reduction activities, which is just like a very fancy way of saying like exploring things like use of drugs and alcohol to like manage the things that are going on inside them. Things like self-harm, like that's something that might come up in a space. You might notice that there's cuts on a young person, and it's not something that we have to kind of stop everything and draw our attention to, but it is something that like we need to pay attention to and notice and say like, okay, this young person is struggling, there's something going on here. And also just shifts in like how a young person interacts socially, like noticing if there's irritability, if there's just differences in the social dynamics that are happening within the space. Were people friends and all of a sudden aren't friends? Like what's going on under there? Because that's going to impact um, the kind of performance as well as the well-being and overall mental health of the young people that you're interacting with. Um, yeah, and I think the other piece that I would offer is just like, yeah, what would it be like to, instead of, you know, punishing a missed practice, to get really curious around like what's going on? Like that's not like you. I'm curious about that. I want to understand, and also maybe to even support like if they said they weren't feeling well, like okay, I respect that. You needed some time, you needed some space to recover. And again, back to that idea of like how can you support the whole human that's in front of you.
I just kind of chime in there real quick. One more follow-up thing. I wanted to just make sure I had mentioned also as far as coaching goes, is like assessing kids have very different relationships with competition. And if we just kind of give a blanket approach to competition, then the kids that are not ready for a lot of competition or intense competition, that's when they leave sports. So like finding ways to build up that resilience to competition is a really important thing for coaches to be able to do so that kids aren't leaving. Because once they're in over their head of competitive level, then they just don't feel like they belong there.
Very important factor. Very important factor. Thinking about this this coaching and leadership element that adults are having to really bring in into youth movement spaces while also being potentially trauma impacted even as adults, right? I know I think it was either C or Ian mentioned the potential living vicariously through the youth, and so that added layer of pressure to perform in order just to make your parent happy. So we have the performance element, we got competitive amongst competition amongst peers, and then trying to satisfy some parental relationship as well. Thinking about and maybe this is actually a good pivot into the remainder of the conversation. What are some practical ways that we can support youth? I know, Ian, you already sort of touched on a little bit of this when you mentioned, like, so what are some of the repetitive things that we can bring into an environment that allows the brain to sort of self-organize and the person to self-organize in a very natural way? I want to think more through about what sort of practices maybe you have found really beneficial, particularly maybe working with not just trauma impacted youth, but youth who are just like in their development process, right? Where the hormones are going crazy, a lot of sensory overwhelm from every direction, a lot of pressures. What do you think we should be doing to maybe change our approach, shift or adapt our approach as leaders in this field? And maybe, Angelica, could we start with you with this question? What are some practical tools that we could implement to support youth in a different way? And maybe actually, let's frame this question from to the leaders, to the coaches, to the trainers, and to the mental health professionals.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's great. Yeah, I think that starting with practices that allow for young people to just kind of show up in the space and shift from whatever they were doing before to where they are right now. And knowing that they're still going to be all the stuff is still going to be with them, but how can we support them in coming into this space in an embodied way? And that can look like, maybe there's an opportunity to start slowly. Maybe there's a check-in. Maybe there's a way to just like connect as humans together. Maybe there's a way to explore like an opportunity for a couple rounds of breath together. Doesn't have to be anything fancy or pre-prescribed, just a second to show up all as humans in our own bodies in this present moment. And I think that can be starting with something like that, ending with something like that can be a great way to build kind of what Ian was talking about too, about that sense of like, am I safe and do I belong? Really kind of inviting people into the space and intentionally building not just competition, but community. And also I think coming back to that, like, that idea that there's a lot of pushing that happens for young people right now. And so how can leaders, coaches, teachers, wherever your role is, how can you allow for like some softness too? And what would that mean to invite softness where it's like, you seem tired, you don't have to push through it right now. Do you want to go take a seat? Like, let's relax. Like, how can that be part of it too? Because that's what makes all of this sustainable. And that's what allows a young person to really flourish and feel like I'm not a machine. I'm a human and I can meet my own needs and I have value beyond my performance.
That's so huge. The rest and recovery element being just as essential as the lifting, the actual sport specific performance work, and uplifting that as a valuable tool is, it's been a huge part of the conversation with TIWL, especially for a long time with coaches who've come in. And I think it will continue to be, especially as performance continues to like go to new levels and the demand that is required shows up in new levels. Maybe for C and Ian, we kind of talked about this sense of safety, belonging, confidence building, the trust that that needs to be developed and kind of fostered, especially between like coach and athlete, or child and parent, or student and teacher. You've kind of touched on this already, but I'm wondering if you have any other things that maybe you've implemented, whether environmentally or communally within your spaces, to kind of bridge and create more trust and confidence building and safety. Um, yeah, C, would you mind taking us off?
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I have done, and I started doing it quite a few years ago, is and it specifically started when I started the CrossFit class at my school. We would start with the club or whatever. It's
Uh-oh, C, I think we
whoops.
kind of lost you for a minute. Is it just me? Oh,
Oop.
okay.
Can you hear me now?
We
Okay.
can hear you
It
now. Do you
something
mind
went
do you
across
mind
and it
taking it
said
from
you're
the top?
muted by the system.
Okay. Can you
Oh
take it
yeah.
from the
So
top?
I started implementing like the narrative that when you walk it through these doors, you're going to leave your ego at the door, because yes, you're probably going to be really good at something one day and somebody else is going to be really bad. But the next day we might do a skill and they're going to be really good at it and you're going to be really bad. So let's all come in with a perspective of we're going to do the best we can do. We're going to help each other out, but we're not going to act like, some idiots when we walk in here. We're going to be kind to one another. So that was kind of like to get the tone of the mindset when you come in. And then like as far I agree with Ian, your relationship with the students or the players or even adults, like if you don't feel like you belong or that this is a good space for you to be in, you you are not going to give the best for yourself or for whatever the event is. So um, I think consistency, like things that are kind of like monotonous almost. Like, so I have a warm up that's, when they come in, you just automatically go into this. It's like, it takes like 7 minutes, but everybody knows you walk in. It's not like, oh my God, what are we doing? It's like, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then we learn what we're going to add on to that later. Sometimes in that, we'll throw out a question out like, and for me at school, like I try to incorporate nutrition as much as I can. So I might ask a question, hey, what's your favorite healthy breakfast? Or, something silly. And then you like later on you can be like, oh, Candace, I saw, you like bacon too. How do you like it cooked? Or so it gives me a talking point with you. But also it could lead us into another discussion, about how to use that, or maybe that's not a great idea without saying it's a terrible idea. Um, and then the when we talk about the developmental part is I feel like, and I've worked with one of our coaches at school and they do this with their team now, is obviously with the team, like you have games, you have certain things that you have to get done during your practice time. But there are some times that are open where you can say, hey, we're going to do this new thing. Here's 3 different levels of the new thing. So if you are terrified of it, you can choose the easiest version and then you realize, oh, I'm not so bad at that. Maybe I want to try the next one. Or the kid that's like gung ho, they can go straight for the high level deal if that's where they are in their comfort zone. And I think incorporating choices, um, you know, kind of like when we talked about in class, like inviting them to do stuff, but sometimes you can't invite a yes or no. It's kind of like, okay, we're going to do this, but you have a choice of, X, Y, and Z. And you can kind of pick what feels good for you at the moment. And then we can progress off of that, depending on how you do. Um, and then another thing that I like to do is at the end, because I feel like if we utilize mental health language more and make it the norm versus like the stigma, um, people are going to be more likely to talk to you about it. They're going to be more likely to, hey, I'm not feeling great today. You know, something was going on. So instead of you not coming in and doing the work, you're coming in and it's a safe place to say, this is a high intensity workout today, but I'm going to be down here low because I'm not there today. And then I can be like, cool, thanks for letting me know. But it gives them the authority to communicate that with you without being, there's no judgment, there's no whatever. And they're more likely to do that. And then my kids, or even my adults, they felt a Google form. So like if I'm training you, you scan a QR code and there's questions, and I can base where you are on a daily or whenever I see you per session of where are you, because you said after the workout, this is what you felt, this is what you thought you did good, this is where you thought you needed some work. So maybe you have someone who they just did clean the most beautiful you've ever seen, but on their form they think they need to work on it. So I can go, hey, hey John, what's going on? I saw you feel like you need to work on that. Can you explain or extend that for me? What did you feel like was bad? So I can see, are they way off the mark with how they're viewing themselves, or were they talking about a specific thing in it? But it gives us a talking point, and I feel like it also builds a little bit of trust between you and whoever it is, because one, they know you're reading it. They're more likely to type stuff than they are to say it a lot of times, especially kids. um, so those are just some things that I've tried to integrate and use, to make it a little bit better.
Thank you so much. See, Ian, anything you want to add there?
Well, C just stole a lot of my answer.
Fair.
But like, which is a good thing, right? But yeah, part of my answer was just going to be those rituals at the beginning, right? Whether it's like every kid has a handshake or you have one handshake, those rituals at the beginning and that warm up, the same every time. So we talk a lot about predictability. A kid knows what they're getting at the beginning, and some choice as well is one thing that we try to advocate for is choice. Now, there's a fine line between like choice and structure, if you will, but giving youth or kids the choice within a program or within a practice is one thing I would add as well. And then I was also going to talk about the at CHS we call it team time, but like bringing people together at the end and having like a real convo. And it all starts with the relationship that a few of us have mentioned before. You can't just like throw out a mental health question to the group if you haven't like laid that foundation of trust and safety. I will add, uh, since C covered it so well, I will add like from a systemic level, and shout out to Dana Harris on the call, who's working hard on the systemic level here in Boston. But on the systemic level, there needs to be more of a recentering and refocusing on joy as the reason for youth sports. I think a lot of people have been watching the World Cup, and one thing that I've taken away, there's been a lot of arguments about why US can't compete, et cetera. What I take away what I take away is Norway. Norway is the population size of South Carolina. And I just read an article recently about how Norway, their main focus is fun in sports. And this is from the country that gives you know, very few prisons and, free healthcare, universal healthcare. So I don't think there's a coincidence that their sports system focuses on joy. And if we're being honest, that is actually the best way to perform, right? We perform best if we're enjoying the thing. I'm married to someone who didn't touch a soccer ball for 10 years after she was uh, performing for her school, her parents, her friends, her image. Um, and that's not the point of sports, right? That creates more harm. So I think just refocusing on a systemic level on what is the actual point of it all, you know what I mean? And the thing that people don't understand, or that people are not getting, is that that will lead to performance, both on and off the field. That's how powerful sport can be if we use these concepts that everyone's talking about.
Yeah. But would it be okay if I jump in
Please
for a
do.
moment?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate all that you both offered so much. And just want to add that like it's kind of the idea of it feels like a lot of work to put in the relationships, to put in the play, to put in the focus on choice, predictability. It can feel like work because it's different, but it ends up bringing so much more of what we're actually looking for to the front. And it's kind of like you're either going to do the work on the front end or you're going to do the work on the back end. And it's like, why not do it on the front end where we can um, prevent a lot of burnout, a lot of, and honestly, a lot of, traumatic responses too, to what happens in some athletic spaces. And really, something that I notice in doing trauma sensitive yoga sessions with young people is often them walking in and kind of being like just so nervous about needing to do it right, or being told by adults all the time that they need to do something in a different way, that that's not how they should use their body, that that's not, some like, no. And what would it be like to offer more space where we just kind of put a little power back into the young person and say like, you probably know some things that I don't about your body, probably a lot of things. And so like you have wisdom to offer, you have knowledge about what feels right for you, about how you need to do this, and like let's tap into that together.
I love the direction of this, how the conversation got landed here into this space of both joy and like understanding self and identity and community, and how healing that is, and how huge and how much huge space that takes in the conversation of how we approach this work, even in a trauma informed way. I know that for a lot of the coaches and trainers and even clinicians that we work with through trauma informed weightlifting, we do spend some intentional time around what is our professional identity? How do our values show up in the way that we, execute our sessions or relate to the folks that we work with? Because that's such a core component of how we show up to youth, right? In the sense of, we want to create spaces where folks can feel included. People are curious about what's happening inside of their bodies. We are looking, maybe even looking at performance sometimes, but also not penalizing performance in a way that suggests that there's no benefit that comes out of this work if it's not this number or this piece of data. And that feels huge because it offers an example, especially as coaches, to show the youth that they can also learn to develop their own identities in relationship to whatever they're doing, whether they are in competition sports or not. What is your identity to pickleball, right? Even if you're, even if it's not on a competitive team, we can think about, does my identity also include fun? Does my identity also include community? And how does that impact the developmental bridges and obstacles that come up when they're told over and over again that something is wrong or something's not sufficient? I want to nod to the comments that came up in the chat. C. Brown teaching self advocacy. I think Jenny Newman mentioned that identification of internal states. I know we kind of touched on that briefly as well, in the sense of athletes or even youth in general not knowing when to stop, not knowing when they're exhausted, not knowing when to like advocate for themselves and say, okay, no more. Um, I guess if we could, actually, I would like to transition a little bit before we get into our closing here and offer maybe a moment for any questions or Q&A that could be out there from the folks who are attending right now. Um, any thoughts that you're having about this conversation, anything coming up for you, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can hop off of mute and ask a question to our amazing panelists here. Good point, Jamie. They become adults who don't know when to stop as well. Boundary setting is a huge part of this work. Self-advocacy as well.
I can chime in real quick on response to
Sure.
that too. Like as people are thinking, I know this kind of goes without saying, and maybe it's a little bit more obvious for this group, but something that's important to be teaching other adults is that, you can't help keep kids regulated if you can't regulate yourself, right? So like actually doing the work as an adult to have those skills, um, is so important, but often gets lost in our coach coach development, coach training. Um, and so it's just one of those things that's so important that almost all of this that we've talked about, uh, can't be executed if we can't do that as adults. And we've all had stuff that we have to figure out personally, and um, especially when coaches are just volunteers, or parents. They're not going through a professional process to be able to work with kids. They're just passing a Corey essentially, and so I just want to emphasize that as an important part of a systemic change as well.
We saw a couple of questions get in. I actually just want to nod to one thing, this concept of regulation, right? How often it's pictured or suggested to be like when a regulated state is a calm state, is a soft state, is like there is a picture of regulation that everyone is trying to get to. And I think about some of the competitive and especially performance environments and how regulation in those spaces may not be as visible to the naked eye, but I think of regulation too as like this ability to move between states safely, to move between high intensity and low intensity and connection and performance, and to be able to do so in a way that doesn't jolt the system and doesn't take us out of ourselves. And what does that look like to exemplify that not only to youth in high pressure spaces, but also just in regular practice or in regular movement sessions, right? Um, we have a question from Bex that says, can you speak more to the value of rest in the school environment? My computer. I so often hear that kids should push through in the name of resiliency. Any panelists want to take that on? Hop in.
Sure, I can start
I
us
can.
off. Oh, no, go ahead. See, you go.
No, you can go.
All right, Angelica.
Okay.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, I can start it off and pass it over. Um, yeah, I think that that's something that we hear so often in so many different spaces as adults too. We get this idea of like push through, and becomes kind of correlated to resilience somehow. But I would just kind of push back that it's like that's not actually what resilience is. That's maybe a form of resilience for others, but maybe not for yourself. And wonder about like what does it actually look like to engage with true embodied resilience to you, and like what does it mean to you to be able to come back to something. So it might not be pushing through in that moment, it might be pushing through for a couple moments and then being like, nope, this is actually my edge. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to take a moment, but I'm going to come back. And isn't what I just kind of would ask people like, isn't that kind of what resilience actually is? Not just like pushing ourselves to the point where we're ignoring all of our internal feedback, all of our body saying like, hey, I'm in pain, I need to stop. And really being like, no, I hear that, I'm going to respond to that, I'm going to take some effective action and say like, I need to rest in this moment, but I can come back and I will come back. And that's maybe what resilience can look like.
Beautiful definition, Angelica. Thank you. See, any other thoughts?
I definitely agree with that. I was going to say, well, I think resilience and perseverance are good and great, but I think for you as a coach to be able to say, hey, Candace, I really need you to push through this, I have to have that relationship and I have to know you and know where like your levels and your bars are. Because I agree, if you know yourself and you're like, my body and my mind are telling me, like, I need to stop or I'm going to get injured. I view that as resilience also, because you're seeing that you really, really want to do something, but you know the best choice for you is I not to do it right now. I would 100% agree that that would be a huge part of resilience as well. Um, and as far as like using it in school with your athletes, again, I think you have to know each of those individuals and know, because if or think about a PE class for that matter, because you have such a broad range of, a level down here versus a level up here. If the kid up here is like 50% effort, and this kid down here who's still way, way behind is really, really pushing themselves, you need to know those two individuals to reward, or not necessarily reward, but like to commend that student for really pushing themselves beyond, or pushing through something that was uncomfortable to them prior to, even though this kid over here might have won or been faster or whatever the case may be. If that's only half of their effort that of, then okay, that's good, Johnny's doing that, but I'm not gonna like make a big deal out of it because he's warming up. So I think again, you go back to the relationship thing, to be able to put them in the perspective of, yes, you truly are being very resilient in this moment because you know them and you know the hurdles and you know the efforts and you know where they are. I think that would be real. It's really, really important to me to know. You have to have that information before you can make that determination of whether they were doing it or not. I think.
Very powerful stuff, see. Thank you. We have another question from Jackson Boots Miller. How do you teach coaches to manage their own burnout and stress? It can be hard to bring joy and authenticity every day to the practice as the coach as well. Ian, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, the beautiful thing is that like the answer is the same for the adults as the kids, right? Like, finding those those pattern movements, the things that calm you down, leaning into those connections and those relationships, and also building up your own resilience, kind of scaffold by scaffold. And I think what coaches find when they have started to implement some of that stuff with their kids, and their kids are starting to kind of like be in that safe place, in that joyful place. They're starting to perform, they're starting to enjoy being there, and there's just less of that stuff happening that burns you out. That kid that's having a meltdown, or like these things are going to happen regardless, because you can't control what's going on with the kid outside. But if you set up those things and you have that environment in place, and those kind of predictable things, and those methods of keeping kids regulated and having fun. Um, I just think that the things that burn coaches out happen less, um, and sometimes the burnout isn't at the with the coaching or the sports, and it's outside, and then you're gonna just have to look at your own life and what's going on there. Um, because it could be either thing really, or a combination of both. But I really think that if you implement a lot of these things that are good for kids, it just makes a coach's job more enjoyable. It makes it, you can just really focus on what is fun about coaching, as opposed to like focusing on, you know, correcting behavior, or uh, keeping kids motivated, but things like that. Those types of things tend to happen on their own if you set a foundation of the things that are proven to work from a brain development standpoint.
And I just want to nod to something you mentioned too earlier, Anne. You mentioned, like, I don't want to miss it. It was one of you. I'm getting them all mixed up now. But talking about the importance of having collaborators alongside of you, like having your own dedicated team that you can rely on as a coach during your moments of burnout and stress, right? And that could be another volunteer coach, also being mindful that they are volunteers, but having teams of support where um, we're able to lean on our systems as well as our own practices that may exist outside of the coaching sphere. As we know, coaching is also very physically and energetically demanding on its own. And if that's the only time that we get that as coaches, we get to be in our body, that could be a lot, right? And so, how do we bring back some of the embodiment healing practices and the somatic practices that we're implementing in practice or in movement sessions in our own time, right? Away from, disconnected from the sport or the type of movement work that we're doing. We have another question. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to be mindful of time. But I want to see if we can take one more question here. Jeremy Jacobson, how does TIWL think about balancing A, creating a safe space dictated by the comfort levels of athletes, B, encouraging athletes to push past what they think they can do and are comfortable with? Really, really good question. So how do we balance the safety choice collaboration with performance growth expansion piece? Let's see. C, do you have any thoughts as a recent TIWL graduate?
You broke up. Can you repeat part of the question again?
Yeah, so I
I was
think
trying to find it and read it real quick, but I didn't see where you
the
were at.
I think the premise of the question is essentially how do we balance creating a safe space while thinking about the comfort level of maybe athletes alongside of the performance piece of pushing past what they think they're capable of. Like what is the bridge between those two that you would say is probably most important?
I think the relationship again. I think that, if whatever your task at hand is, you can uh, educate them on how important it is, or why are we doing it, but also knowing, like, you know if if I have developed a relationship and I know your capabilities, I'm going to be better able to guide you to be successful, number one, and to stay safe, right? So if you know that we have this pattern where, you know you come to me to give you guidance, I give you the guidance, and we keep you in a safe space as we inch up or go towards whatever your goals are. If I come to you and say, hey, today this is what I need you to do, and maybe there were three choices, right? And I say, hey, you're going to do this middle one, and I explain to you why, and here's what you're going to work on when you do that, so everybody's doing the same thing, but your focus is here. I feel like you're going to be more likely to trust me, and know that I have your best intentions, or you are the most important piece. Your intentions are, more important. Then you're going to be able to achieve the goal, and now you're working towards that, whatever that competitive thing is that we're trying to come in, or the competition part of it. um because we trust one another, because we know where you're at. I know where you're at, you know where you're at, and we're learning you together. So I think, I really feel like it all comes back to what's the relationship that you have, and is there a trust piece component there or not? Um, do I give you space to communicate to me and tell me your needs and your wants, and how something felt when you did it? Maybe it looked great, but it felt like crap. Okay, let's break it down and see why. But if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, or I don't take the time to ask you anything, I don't really think it matters what you do from that point. It's going to be maybe that person is driven enough that they're going to get it done. And if they're not, they're just going to be like, ah, whatever, I'm not going to do that. Or I'm just going to halfway, I'm going to what it, and it'll be what it is. Whereas you have that trust component, I think, that you get from the relationship. I think that's where you get the best growth, for lack of a better word.
Relationships for the win. I want to thank everyone for being here today and engaging in this amazing conversation. And also a big thank you to our panelists. Before we break away, I'm wondering if each of you don't mind sharing maybe a short, quick final thought, anything that might still be resonant that maybe some folks can take away from this conversation. And also where to find you and maybe anything else that you may have coming up shortly. Really quickly, let's start with you, Ian.
Sure. I I'm blanking on any final thought, but
Okay.
you can find me. I work for Intercity Weightlifting in Boston. I'm the head of development there. So if you're in the Boston area, hit me up. Come get a workout and learn about what we do. We essentially work with people that are most impacted by mass incarceration and have safety barriers due to street violence. And we teach a personal training certification and then help them with whatever career, whether it's within fitness or otherwise. And a lot of it is really intense as far as what the trauma is that we're trying to help heal in the gym. A lot of it is centered around workforce development, but people can't hold down jobs if they don't have that all the things that we've talked about in this call surrounding it. So and then for CHJS, we lead trainings for coaches all over the country, really. So it's not just a Boston thing. One of our founders is here in Boston, Megan Bartlett, who's amazing. So check her out. And me and her are the ones representing Boston and teaching coaches, all the things that we talked about today, and also trying to change the system from the top down as well. So those are my two favorite organizations and the ones that pay me. So thank you, Candace, for having me today.
For sure, Ian. Thank you. Angelica?
Yeah, I'll just say I love the conversation about relationship, and I think holding that at the center and also holding the idea of the whole person at the center, that with those two things could do a lot of good just by themselves. And you add play to it and joy, then you've got a whole party. And so if you want to learn more about what I do, I'm at therapywithangelica.com, and would love to connect with any of you further. So thank you so much for having me, and this conversation's been great.
Thank you, Angelica. See.
Well, CrossFit Cape and Lupin. So if you're ever in the Lewis, Rehoboth, Dewey area and you want to work out, let me know. It's a nonprofit. You can stop by. I'll give you a workout. um, I think like three things I think that are important for if you guys wanted to take away is like think process over the outcome or the production. So I think even when you reach the pinnacle of what you think you want, sometimes it's like underwhelming because you only had that one thing. Versus if you learn to love the process, I think it'll always be fun and whatever. And if you can do that by strengthening your relationships, and then I think part of that is like making mental health language like an everyday thing. So it's again not a stigma thing. Encourage. I mean, I tell my students how I feel. I've recently had a gastrectomy. I have no stomach due to stomach cancer, and I had to learn how to regulate better. And I communicate with them, and I feel like it has made them communicate back more with me, beyond what our normal was. And as a coach, I would highly encourage you as coaches to encourage your kids or teenagers to play multiple sports. If for no other reason, if you're really, really good at something, try something new so that you kind of get the mental aspect of what it's like to be a learner or the lower skilled person. I think that's a valuable lesson to take into the thing that you're really good at. I think it just makes you a better, broader athlete. So, and it's good to try and learn new things. It's good for your brain. So, but it's about all I have. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, C. Thank you to all of our panelists. I know we are a little bit over time, but I appreciate your expertise, your stories, and just your willingness to share some of the lessons that you've learned. We hope that you have enjoyed this panel. Again, I am Candace Liger with Trauma Informed Weightlifting. We have our upcoming certificate program taking place at the end of August, and so applications are now open to become certified in trauma informed weightlifting, as well as our Lift fundraiser, where we'll have some live locations of trauma informed weightlifting across the nation. So we'll send that out via email in the recap and the recording. In the meantime, we hope that you have taken something really valuable from this panel, and we look forward to seeing like more of what you're going to do in the world. Ian, Angelica, and C, thank you again. We look forward to having you a part of the CFTE network. Until then, let's go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you. Y'all take care and have a good one. Bye.
Peace.
Thank you. Bye.